Have you ever wondered why deep thinkers often appear lost in thought, or why their emotions seem intense, silent, or even mysterious? What if the emotions we struggle with aren't just feelings, but encrypted messages from a part of the mind we rarely understand? In this journey, we step inside the mind of a deep thinker through the lens of one of psychology's most brilliant minds, Carl Jung. His ideas about the unconscious, emotions, and the soul reveal not only what we feel, but why we feel in the first place. So stay with me as we uncover the emotional truth buried beneath deep thought. If you're someone who overthinks, overfeels, or simply wants to understand the architecture of human emotions, this speech is for you. Subscribe to Whispers of Psychology, and let's begin this inner exploration together. Ladies and gentlemen, Carl Jung once said, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious." To him, emotions weren't just inconvenient bursts of feeling. They were messengers, signals from the vast and often misunderstood realm of the unconscious mind. And this is where our exploration begins. Unlike Sigmund Freud, who focused largely on suppressed desires, Jung believed the unconscious was not just a place of repression, but also a potential, guidance, and wisdom. He viewed it as the deep ocean beneath the surface of our thoughts, and emotions were like waves, rising from hidden depths to tell us something about ourselves. For a deep thinker, emotions aren't easily brushed aside. They're not experienced as fleeting moods, but as persistent energies. Jung would argue that this is because the unconscious mind in such individuals is more active, more sensitive, and more willing to communicate through feeling. You see, Jung described emotions as irrational, not in a dismissive way, but as something that defied logical explanation. He noted that emotional reactions are often disproportionate to external events. For example, why would a small comment from someone trigger a strong internal storm in a deep thinker? According to Jung, it's because that comment didn't just land in the conscious mind. It struck a nerve in the unconscious. It's here that emotional truth resides. And for the deep thinker, this truth cannot be ignored. Unlike the average person, who might distract themselves with noise or activity, the deep thinker is often forced to sit with their emotions. They analyze them, question them, sometimes obsess over them, and for good reason. Jung believed that these emotional stirrings are signs of something deeper, a forgotten memory, a neglected desire, an unresolved conflict. One of Jung's most famous ideas is that what we resist persists. When we ignore our emotions, especially those arising from the unconscious, they don't go away. They return in disguised forms: anxiety, recurring dreams, even physical illness. For a deep thinker, these emotional echoes are often louder and harder to silence. Jung also believed that emotions are symbolic. They are not literal but metaphorical. Feeling heavy might not just mean being sad. It might represent emotional burdens we carry from the past. Feeling anxious might not just be about the present. It could reflect an inner resistance to change, to uncertainty, or even confronting one's true desires. This is where things become truly profound. Jung didn't believe we should simply analyze our emotions logically. He believed we should listen to them, not as noise, but as music, as language, as clues. And in the mind of a deep thinker, that language is constantly playing. But this isn't always easy. In fact, it can be exhausting. Many deep thinkers find themselves trapped in emotional loops, overanalyzing every feeling, every thought. But Jung warned against this kind of intellectual domination over feeling. He urged people not to control emotions, but to collaborate with them. To Jung, emotions weren't just internal experiences. They were bridges between the conscious and the unconscious, between our outer reality and our inner truth. And for deep thinkers, walking these bridges is a daily reality. Sometimes it brings insight, sometimes despair, but always it brings the opportunity for growth. This is why Jung's ideas are so relevant today. In a world obsessed with rationality, speed, and surface-level living, deep thinkers, those who pause, feel, and reflect, are more important than ever. Their emotions might seem intense, unpredictable, or even irrational to others. But to Jung, that was the point. Because only when we allow the irrational to rise do we touch the soul. He believed that no true transformation, psychological or spiritual, can occur without emotion. Logic alone cannot heal. Thinking alone cannot evolve the self. It is through emotions that the soul speaks. And for the deep thinker, that voice is always whispering beneath the noise of the world. So the next time you feel something you can't explain, a sadness without cause, a joy that comes from nowhere, a fear that doesn't make sense, pause. Ask yourself not what's wrong with me, but what is my unconscious trying to say? Because if Jung was right, and many still believe he was, then your emotions aren't flaws in your thinking. They are the hidden truth of who you are becoming. And that, perhaps, is the greatest insight of all. Deep thinkers often find themselves caught in a silent war, a psychological tension between their analytical mind and the emotions they struggle to interpret. Carl Jung understood this inner conflict intimately. He proposed that individuals with a strong inclination toward introspection are not just prone to deep thought, but also profound emotional experiences, many of which they cannot always explain logically. This constant internal dialogue can be both enlightening and emotionally draining. Jung believed that the psyche is not just made up of conscious thoughts, but also shaped by unseen forces operating in the background, what he called the unconscious. For deep thinkers, the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious is more porous than in most people. This means they are more sensitive to internal shifts and more likely to experience intense emotions without clear external triggers. When this happens, they often attempt to intellectualize these emotions, trying to dissect and understand them. But Jung cautioned against this tendency. He argued that over-reliance on thinking can actually distance us from emotional truth. This is one of the core emotional struggles of a deep thinker. They are wired to make sense of everything. Their first instinct is to analyze, to seek clarity through reason. But emotions don't follow logical rules. They emerge spontaneously, driven by unconscious material, personal history, and symbolic meaning. Jung believed that when deep thinkers apply too much rational pressure to emotions, they risk misinterpreting or even repressing them, leading to emotional stagnation or distortion. The result is a psychological loop. The thinker experiences a powerful emotion, then immediately tries to reduce it to a concept or explanation. If the emotion resists this intellectualization, as many do, the person becomes frustrated, anxious, or even more emotionally overwhelmed. This unresolved tension can lead to feelings of inner chaos. And yet, from Jung's perspective, this very chaos is fertile ground for growth. He believed that only by entering into this tension, rather than escaping it, can the individual begin the process of true emotional integration. Another key element in this inner conflict is the idea of persona. Jung described the persona as the mask we wear to adapt to society, our outward identity. Deep thinkers are often aware of the disconnect between their persona and their inner world. They might appear calm, composed, or even detached externally, but internally they could be experiencing a storm of conflicting emotions, fears, and insights. This mismatch creates emotional friction. Over time, the pressure of maintaining this outward image while carrying a hidden emotional life can become unbearable. Jung suggested that such individuals are not broken. They are simply more awake to the complexities of the human psyche. Their emotional depth is not a weakness. It is a sign of psychic sensitivity. However, this sensitivity comes at a cost. Deep thinkers often experience emotional fatigue, social withdrawal, and existential questioning. They don't just feel, they reflect on feeling. They don't just suffer, they analyze the meaning of suffering. This meta-awareness, while intellectually enriching, can make simple emotional experiences feel endlessly complicated. One of Jung's greatest insights was that inner conflict is not something to be eliminated, but something to be engaged with. He saw tension between opposites, thought and emotion, persona and shadow, conscious and unconscious, as essential to psychological development. The goal is not to resolve the conflict by choosing one side, but to hold attention until a new, deeper understanding emerges. Jung called this process transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that allows opposing forces within the psyche to unite and form something new. For the deep thinker, this means learning to sit with emotions without immediately categorizing or solving them. It means allowing themselves to feel fully and without judgment, even when those feelings seem irrational or uncomfortable. Jung emphasized that emotional truth cannot be discovered through logic alone. It must be experienced, processed, and eventually integrated into the self. The emotional conflict faced by deep thinkers then is not a flaw, but a sign of growth and motion. They are pulled in two directions, the desire to understand and the need to feel. And the friction between these forces generates insight, transformation, and eventually wisdom. But only if they are willing to surrender control and trust the process. In the Jungian view, emotions are not just disturbances of thought. They are revelations. Each emotional struggle reveals something previously hidden, a forgotten memory, an unmet need, a suppressed desire, or a neglected part of the self. Deep thinkers, though often overwhelmed by this intensity, are uniquely positioned to uncover and articulate these inner truths, not just for themselves, but for others too. In a world that often values productivity over reflection, deep thinkers may feel alienated or misunderstood. But Jung would argue that their emotional struggles are not only valid, they are necessary. Necessary for self-discovery, for individuation, and for the evolution of human consciousness. The conflict they endure is not the mark of a broken mind, but of a mind in pursuit of something far greater than surface-level understanding, emotional truth. Carl Jung introduced one of the most profound and psychologically transformative concepts in modern depth psychology, the shadow. This is a part of ourselves that we deny, repress, or disown, not because it is necessarily evil or dangerous, but because it doesn't fit with the image we hold of ourselves. For deep thinkers, this hidden self holds particular significance. They are more prone to introspection and inner confrontation, which means they're often more aware of the darkness within and more deeply affected by it. The shadow doesn't just consist of negative traits like envy, anger, selfishness, or fear. It can also hold qualities we consider too powerful, too bold, or too unconventional for our self-image, such as ambition, sexuality, or assertiveness. Jung believed that ignoring or suppressing these aspects doesn't eliminate them. Instead, they retreat into the unconscious, where they gather emotional energy and eventually resurface in unexpected ways, often through intense emotional reactions, projection onto others, recurring dreams, or inner turmoil. Deep thinkers are more likely to encounter their shadow early in life because they are drawn to introspective exploration. Their emotional depth opens the door to subconscious material. A casual emotional reaction for others may become a spiral of inner inquiry for a deep thinker. Why did I feel that way? What does that say about who I am? Over time, this search for answers may lead to encounters with thoughts or feelings that contradict their ideal self-image. These moments are not just confusing. They can be deeply unsettling, triggering shame, fear, or even existential doubt. Jung believed that facing the shadow was not optional for anyone seeking psychological maturity. It is not enough to understand oneself intellectually. One must integrate the rejected or ignored parts of psyche into conscious awareness. This process, he explained, is the gateway to true emotional authenticity. Until the shadow is acknowledged, we remain divided within ourselves, unknowingly controlled by unconscious forces that influence our decisions, moods, relationships, and worldview. For deep thinkers, this can manifest in a constant inner struggle. They may feel guilty for thoughts that arise spontaneously. They may experience emotional responses that seem out of alignment with their values. They may notice patterns of behavior they can't explain, pushing people away, avoiding certain challenges, reacting defensively. These are all clues that a part of the self is acting independently of the conscious ego. The shadow, in this sense, is not just hidden, it's active, and unless brought into the light, it continues to distort the emotional life from the inside out. What makes the experience even more difficult for deep thinkers is their tendency to over-identify with their thoughts and ideals. They often have a strong internal narrative about who they are, or who they are striving to become. When emotions arise that challenge that narrative, such as jealousy in a person who prides themselves on being supportive, or bitterness in someone who values peace, the instinct is often to reject or suppress these feelings. But according to Jung, these moments are opportunities, not threats. They are signals that a deeper part of the psyche is seeking integration. The shadow is not an enemy. It is a mirror. It shows us the parts of ourselves we haven't yet accepted. And Jung argued that emotional healing doesn't happen by eliminating these parts, but by embracing them with awareness. A deep thinker who experiences emotional overwhelm, for example, might come to realize that the feeling stems not from weakness, but from years of unmet emotional needs or suppressed desires. The shame once felt becomes a doorway. The discomfort becomes a guide. Jung also warned that when we ignore the shadow, we often project it onto others. We begin to see in the outside world what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. A deep thinker who denies their own potential for aggression, for instance, may become overly sensitive to perceive hostility in others. The emotional reaction is disproportionate because it isn't just about the present moment. It's about the unresolved material being stirred from within. In this way, our emotional world becomes tangled in illusions, and until we confront the source, we continue to repeat painful patterns. But when we do the difficult work of shadow integration, of naming the emotion, understanding its source, accepting its presence, something remarkable happens. The emotional weight begins to lift. The inner conflict becomes more manageable. What once felt threatening becomes empowering. Jung believed that this act of embracing the shadow was not just therapeutic, it was transformative. It allows us to reclaim parts of ourselves that hold energy, passion, creativity, and power. For deep thinkers, this integration can bring emotional clarity they've never known before. Instead of feeling consumed by their emotional reactions, they begin to understand their origins. Instead of fearing their inner world, they learn to navigate it with courage. And instead of denying their complexity, they learn to express it with wisdom and compassion. This process doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong journey of honesty, humility, and psychological courage. But for those willing to face what lies beneath, the reward is profound. A fuller self, a clearer emotional life, and a mind no longer at war with its own truth. Carl Jung believed that the ultimate goal of the human psyche is not perfection, but wholeness. This wholeness is achieved through a process he called individuation, a lifelong journey of becoming the most authentic version of oneself by integrating all parts of the personality, including those that are unconscious, repressed, or in conflict. For deep thinkers, this process often begins with emotional tension. The search for clarity, inner peace, and personal meaning drives them to confront their inner world. But emotional integration, true emotional maturity, does not come from thinking alone. It requires facing one's feelings fully and bringing them into alignment with the self. Emotions, in Jung's view, are not obstacles on the path to enlightenment. They are the path. They act as signals pointing toward parts of the self that have not yet been accepted or understood. When we ignore these emotional cues, especially in favor of intellectual control or external conformity, we delay our individuation. Deep thinkers frequently fall into this trap. Their desire for understanding can lead to an overemphasis on thought and theory, while their emotions remain raw, unprocessed, and disconnected. But Jung's theory reminds us that personal development depends on the integration of emotion and thought, feeling, and reflection. Integration begins with recognition. The deep thinker often experiences emotions that feel disproportionate, mysterious, or even conflicting. These are not failures of logic, but signs that something within the unconscious is attempting to rise into awareness. A sudden wave of sadness might not be about a current event, but about a long-buried experience that was never grieved. An inexplicable anger might be tied to a boundary that has been repeatedly violated, yet never consciously acknowledged. Rather than dismissing these feelings, Jung urged individuals to engage with them, not by analyzing the depth, but by letting them unfold. This requires humility. One of the great challenges for deep thinkers is accepting that not everything can be solved through cognition. The intellect is powerful, but it is not always equipped to process emotion. Emotional integration asks for something more vulnerable, surrender, patience, and honest self-exploration. Jung did not recommend indulging in emotion blindly, but neither did he support suppressing or bypassing it. Instead, he emphasized active dialogue with the unconscious, listening to emotions, dreams, symbols, and instincts, and letting them contribute to the evolving self. Jung described individuation as a spiral rather than a straight line. We return to old wounds, old fears, and old patterns, but each time with more awareness, more strength, and more capacity for integration. For the deep thinker, this spiral is often intense and demanding. The emotions they encounter can be deeply tied to identity, meaning, and existential purpose. But every emotional truth, no matter how uncomfortable, carries a gift, the potential to transform into self-knowledge. In practice, this process might look like confronting the shadow, reevaluating values, accepting personal contradictions, or grieving past losses. It could involve therapy, journaling, solitude, creativity, or simply time spent in quiet reflection. For some, it might mean acknowledging the pain of unfulfilled dreams. For others, the realization that they have never truly allowed themselves to feel joy. Integration doesn't demand perfection. It asks for honesty. Jung insisted that we must meet ourselves where we are, not where we pretend to be. As individuals move through this emotional integration, something begins to shift. The internal fragmentation, the sensation of being pulled in multiple directions, gives way to coherence. A person starts to feel more rooted in themselves. They no longer need to constantly explain or justify their emotions. They trust them, they listen, and they respond to them not with panic or resistance, but with curiosity and compassion. Jung also recognized that this process has social implications. An emotionally integrated person affects others differently. Their presence carries depth, empathy, and a sense of calm. They are less reactive and more reflective, less trapped in performance, and more invested in connection. Deep thinkers who reach this stage often become guides for others, not by preaching, but simply by embodying the authenticity they've earned through emotional labor. But individuation is not a destination. It is a way of being. There's always more to uncover, more to feel, more to integrate. Jung called it a sacred journey, one that bridges the conscious and unconscious, the mind and the heart, the personal and the universal. It is a process of becoming whole, not flawless. For deep thinkers, the emotional challenges they face are not signs of weakness. They are the starting points for a deeper truth. Emotions that once seemed intrusive become sources of insight. Inner conflicts that once caused anxiety become invitations to grow. The mind, once burdened with unanswered questions, becomes more spacious. And the self, once divided, begins to move in harmony. Carl Jung believed that the person who embraces their emotional truth, no matter how messy, painful, or complex, is the one who truly evolves. Emotional integration is not easy, but for those willing to walk through it, the reward is immense. Not only a clearer understanding of themselves, but a life that feels honest, grounded, and deeply human. The emotional world of a deep thinker is not a flaw to be fixed, but terrain to be explored. Through Carl Jung's lens, we begin to see that emotions are not just reactions to the world around us. They are revelations from within. They are messages from the unconscious, guiding us toward understanding, healing, and ultimately, wholeness. Jung taught us that our emotions are meaningful, not random, not irrational, not something to suppress or escape. For the deep thinker, who often lives in the tension between introspection and emotion, this realization is liberating. The very inner conflicts that seem like burdens are actually doorways to a more integrated self. The shadow, with all its hidden fears and forgotten desires, is not an enemy. It is a part of us that longs to be seen, heard, and healed. True growth doesn't happen by pushing emotions away or reducing them to abstract concepts. It happens when we sit with them, when we learn from them, when we begin to recognize them not as disruptions, but as teachers. And in this process of emotional integration, what Jung called individuation, we slowly stitch together fragments of who we are into something whole, something real. So, if you find yourself overwhelmed by emotions, lost in thought, or pulled between what you feel and what you think, know that you are not broken. You are on the path of depth, the path of awakening, the path of becoming. And as Jung would remind us, the person who looks outside dreams, but the one who looks inside awakens. Keep thinking deeply, keep feeling fully, and most of all, keep listening to the quiet truth within you, because in that truth lies the beginning of your transformation.